As more and more begin to know, the status quo has got to go. They're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No, a man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
The Pentagon announced on Sunday night that it launched another round of airstrikes in eastern Syria, targeting facilities used by Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and Iran-affiliated groups, and that is referring to the Shia militias who operate in Iraq and Syria. So the strikes mark the third known round of U.S. airstrikes in eastern Syria since U.S. troops in the region have come under a spate of attacks due to President Biden's support for Israel's assault on Gaza. So the Pentagon said on Saturday that U.S. bases have been targeted 48 times since October 17th, leaving 56 American troops injured. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin said that the airstrikes launched on Sunday specifically targeted a training facility and a safe house near the cities of Abu Kamal and Mayadin, which are both located in eastern Syria's Deir ez-Zor province. So the last round of U.S. airstrikes in eastern Syria took place on November 8th, and before that was on October 27th. And if you remember, the U.S. said that these attacks were designed to deter, that these airstrikes were designed to deter further rocket and drone attacks on U.S. bases. Well, that clearly hasn't worked, and U.S. officials have acknowledged that the deterrence strategy has failed. And I just saw some unconfirmed reports on Twitter of more attacks on U.S. bases in Syria, right after these airstrikes. So things are really escalating here, and I think it's unfortunately only a matter of time before American troops start sustaining some serious casualties, or an American troop could be killed. And an umbrella group known as the Islamic Resistance of Iraq has taken credit for most of these attacks, and we've had certain militia leaders come out and put out statements basically saying that these attacks are not going to stop until the war in Gaza stops, until there's a ceasefire. So it's all about that. It's all about U.S. supporting Israel, and the U.S. should not be in Syria and Iraq in the first place. The smart thing to do would be to just bring the troops home instead of escalate the situation, which is what the U.S. is doing here, while claiming they don't want escalation, but it's very clear that these airstrikes are just going to keep provoking more attacks. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said Sunday that Israel should follow the rules of war in Gaza, but would not say if he believed the Israeli military is doing so. So this was really something. And Sullivan made these comments on CNN's State of the Union when he was asked if Israel needed to do more to limit civilian casualties. So Sullivan said that Israel has a responsibility, quote, to operate according to the rules of war, and we have continued to make that point both publicly and privately, and we will continue to do so as we go forward, end quote. So he's asked about the civilian casualties, says Israel must follow the rules of war, but then he's asked if they are following the rules of war and says he's not going to judge Israel. His response to the question was, quote, I'm not going to sit here and play judge or jury on that question, end quote. So I think it's just a really good kind of encapsulation of the attitude of the Biden administration, of the U.S. when it comes to what's going on in Gaza. We're seeing this mass slaughter of civilians and children, and they're saying, hey, that's not good, but they're not really doing anything to stop it. They're supporting it 100%. And even when asked questions like this, do you think they're following the rules of war? And what are the rules of war? What rules is the U.S. going by? The U.S. doesn't apply international law if it doesn't suit its interests. So, but just that reply, again, just a good encapsulation, I think, of the attitude. So Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said several times in recent days that the Israeli Defense Forces is the only force that can control Gaza after the war, signaling plans for a long-term military occupation. So he made some comments on Friday at a meeting with Israeli mayors. He said, quote, IDF forces will remain in control of the Strip. We will not give it to international forces, end quote. If you remember, there were reports that said the U.S. and Israel was considering some sort of multinational force in Gaza. So we've seen the Biden administration officials say that they don't want Israel to reoccupy Gaza, but the U.S. has not placed any conditions on its support for Israel's campaign. So Netanyahu told NBC's Meet the Press, quote, we need to see the following two things. Gaza has to be demilitarized and Gaza has to be de-radicalized. And I think so far we haven't seen any Palestinian force, including the Palestinian Authority, that is able to do that, end quote. So I had to mention here some, what I think is important context, and I linked to this great article that Scott Horton and Connor Freeman wrote titled Netanyahu's support for Hamas has backfired. They published it about 2 weeks ago, but they actually updated it the other day with just some more quotes. And it's really about this strategy that Netanyahu and other Israeli officials have had. They don't want a Palestinian state, within the West Bank and Gaza. So they've kind of capitalized on the split between the different Palestinian factions, Hamas and the Palestinian Authority. And, the big quote from Netanyahu, this is from a 2019 meeting, Likud party meeting, and it just illuminates his strategy when it comes to Hamas, keeping them separate from the PA in the West Bank. Netanyahu said, quote, anyone who wants to thwart the establishment of a Palestinian state has to support bolstering Hamas and transferring money to Hamas. This is part of our strategy to isolate the Palestinians in Gaza from the Palestinians in the West Bank, end quote. Here, President Biden is meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping, and that is going to happen this Wednesday in San Francisco at this APEC summit. And this comes, of course, amid very high tensions, and this report from the South China Morning Post says that contentious issues are on the table. So they're going to be discussing the need for military to military dialogue. Apparently the White House said it's going to be contentious talks. And, as I always point out, because I think it's important to point out, the U.S. kind of frames these talks that they've been having with Chinese officials as a way to manage the competition and not really a way to resolve issues. They just want to keep going the course they're going with China with this military buildup, right near China and all this new support for Taiwan. But try to act like they're doing it responsibly.
You're listening to Part of the Problem on the Gas Digital Network.
Chris Christie, I can't even believe his commitment to war talking points. In terms of whatever paycheck he gets and whoever he really works for, the fact that he's still up there selling that the Ukraine war is noble, just, and needs to happen. Yeah. We need, it's over. And he's still there in the fourth quarter giving a hoorah speech of, no, we need to be backing and fighting this war.
You know what he reminds me of? He reminds me of, do you ever see there were these people who would swear there were weapons of mass destruction 3-4 years after Bush and Cheney had given up on
Still
it.
going for it. No one told them it's over yet.
Dude, they're not even spewing this propaganda anymore. Even the guys themselves, they're like, no, we did find weapons of mass destruction because we found this one stockpile. And then if you actually look into the details of it, it's like, oh yeah, no, we found the old weapons that we had sold Saddam Hussein in 1980 that were defunct at this point. You know what I mean? It's just, and you're like, oh yeah, if they really found weapons of mass destruction, how come Bush isn't bringing this up? How come Cheney's not bringing it up? Even they've abandoned this, and yet you're still on this. And so is the choice really between, if you look back at, say, what was the choice between John McCain and Mitt Romney and Mike Huckabee? It was, who delivers this better? Who do you think is the best guy to say the same thing that we're all going to say to every single question? That's what it always was. And so I'm grateful that Vivek was in these debates, because at least then there's someone saying some of the things that we would like. I will say that on the podcast and in these presidential debates, I just think Vivek's answers on the Israel-Palestine war is just not good enough. I think that he's taking the non-interventionist position, which I do appreciate, but it seems like when it came to the debate, he was almost trying to make an effort. And this was the one area he was doing such a great job at separating himself on everything else, but it seems like he's just not willing to do it on this. But if you actually listen to what he's saying, he is taking the non-interventionist position. But in the debate, he did his best to make sure that he also sounded like everybody else while he took it.
Or direction in defending themselves. So what I would tell Bibi is that Israel has the right and the responsibility to defend itself. I would tell him to smoke those terrorists on his southern border, and then I'll tell him as president of the United States, I'll be smoking the terrorists on our southern border.
You can kind of tell what he's doing is he's like, look, I'm technically taking the non-interventionist point. I'm saying you smoke those terrorists, I'll smoke these terrorists, but he's also trying his best to sound like everybody else. I would just say to Vivek, this would be my advice. When people were speculating whether I gave him debate advice or not, I did not. But this would be my advice to him that I'll make quite publicly. I'll say, look, when you're this far out of the national security apparatus consensus, when you're already calling other people out for making money from the military-industrial complex, when you're already calling out what a sham the whole war in Ukraine was, let me break this to you. You're not going to win back any of that support. Those people who need you to toe the line of the military-industrial complex are not going to support you anyway. So you might as well just tell the truth, okay? You might as well, at a certain point, the principle in marketing, which is called product differentiation, is more valuable to you than this, I don't want to be opposed by, I don't know, by the Israeli lobby or something like that. Guess what? They're not going to support you. You're not going to be their guy. So it doesn't matter. And you might as well just separate yourself from this insanity. Because, look, I mean, Jesus Christ, like you just think about what Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis there, and then of course Tim Scott and Chris Christie, by the way, they both echoed the exact same statements. Take them out. Whatever needs to be done, we will give you whatever you need whenever you need it. So we are all in on what? What exactly? No, they're not clear about that. What actually needs to be done? So in the last couple of weeks, how many people have died? Reports say 10,000, maybe more than that. Who knows? But how many of them? How many of them do you need to kill? We're all in. Whatever you need, whenever you need it, whatever you want to do, Israel. That's our position. That's what all of the Republican establishment types are saying. And I'm sorry, it is sickening. It's sickening. You're talking about actions that have killed, as horrific as what happened on October 7th was. You're talking about actions that have already eclipsed that in terms of innocent people dying. And you're saying, clearly you're saying that's not enough. We need more, right? So how much more? And it's amazing how, like, when the war fever first breaks out, when people are like talking like this, none of them need to be specific at all. None of them need to say, like, well, like, you know, how many innocent people need to die before you would question this? How much money do they get before we would question this? What? Just whatever. Go do it all. And I think it's a real, I think it's a big mistake, both morally and strategically, for Vivek to just say, yeah, my advice to you would be to go smoke those terrorists. By the way, none of us would have a problem. None of us would have a problem if that's all Israel was doing, was smoking terrorists. That'd be fine. I'm a little bit concerned about the smoking the children, you know, like that to me is a bit of a moral problem.
Yeah, his position is essentially, listen, I'll let you guys go bomb those buildings, just not with our money.
Yeah.
Where I think what you might be missing is perhaps this helps him in his auditioning for the VP role, and that opposing all the other stuff is more in line with Donald Trump's policy, whereas to actually criticize and shed light on the grim reality of what Israel's doing right now might prohibit him from, like, being chosen for a VP or cabinet position.
Yeah, I guess maybe I just don't understand, why does Vivek even want the VP position? I
think that sets him up because Trump is only a one-term president.
Yeah, so I guess VP, you're right.
That makes him front runner in the next election. It's very. I mean, if he really wants to be president, that's firstly, he might feel that he can actually influence policy. Take it or leave it. I think that's more of a. I think that's just more of a VP puts you as the front runner, so you can't possibly win it in this one.
Yeah. I guess you're right. I guess there's a point to that, but goddamn, yeah, I just wish you would just kind of tell the truth on this.
And to be able. I mean, if I was in charge and I brought the empire home, then what would that look like now that China is by far the dominant power in the region?
There would continue to be little skirmishes over the contested claims in the South and East China Seas. Those are really more about dominating those maritime routes for the purposes of exploiting the natural resources that are there. It isn't that whoever gets them won't want to sell them and use them and create more economic gains for all of us. It's not as though if China, had it, that they wouldn't want to sell it or engage in economic transactions. The same thing goes for Taiwan. China wants to continue to trade with Taiwan. They're not going to eat the semiconductors. They'll want to sell them to the rest of the world. China will just continue to do economic activities with its neighbors. Its population will continue to get older. Its economy will continue to slow down. It's hard to say much of what would happen after that. It's not going to conquer India or any of its neighbors. While it does have the military capabilities, according to, legitimate experts, which, like, you've had Lyle Goldstein on, who say, if China was really, really determined, they could definitely take over Taiwan, but it would be at a huge cost. And it would be a huge risk for Xi politically as well. Lost wars have a tendency to destabilize, a ruler's grip on power, not only popularly in the street, but also within the corridors of power where, an internal coup could very easily be realized. And of course, there are significant risks to, an amphibious assault of that nature. Yeah. So. No, none of this affects the United States at all. And in fact, even when China was far, far weaker than it is now, back in the 1950s, Murray Rothbard wrote a series of articles castigating the idea that the United States needed to defend Taiwan even way back then, and called out the whole idea of island hopping and conquering its neighbors. It's always been a red herring that's meant to justify, Washington's preferred policies of attempted global hegemony.
Yeah. Really, I'd like to really understand the degree of the decoupling of America's economy from China since, say, Trump, maybe even before that, if you want to start before that. But I know Trump really put these tariffs up and really wanted to try to separate our economy more and more, which is so dangerous.
He wanted to, but it mostly failed. It mostly failed. And there are very obvious reasons for it. And you can just look at the total volume of trade. The Economist last year ran, just the most predictable article that like, oh my gosh, it looks like even the sanctioned products aren't, getting blocked, because what distributors do is they just break them up into smaller loads. And basically there's a certain tonnage under which the customs inspectors don't even look to see what it is. And so the volume of trade now is as great as it's ever been. It may, in fact, have surpassed it now that COVID has come and gone. So no, decoupling has not been very successful. Key U.S. allies are even getting like waivers, like little permission slips from Washington to like basically just keep doing business as usual. And then let's see, I was just trying to think the farmers. Oh, yeah. And I mean, we wound up paying for that trade war because we wound up having to subsidize our own farmers. Our own farmers were the ones who got hurt the most by that, because the Chinese, of course, enacted their own counter tariffs on American agricultural products, because, of course, China's very, very dependent on imports. And that's maybe something, too, that to emphasize, like, China is far more globalization dependent than the United States. China doesn't want anything to tip over the board. It does want to have its way in its immediate environs, similar to the United States or any number of powers that you could speak to. Even if you look at the European Union, underneath the veil of niceties is Franco-German domination of the continent. They rule the roost. They make the decisions. And everyone else, gains some benefits, takes some losses. I really don't want to dive into that issue, but so it's no different, really. And I do just caution people, like, this stuff does matter. Even things like those little land disputes in the South and East China Sea. I want to emphasize, those could spark the war that we all don't want. Well, I shouldn't say not all of us, maybe. Some people do. Robert Kagan believes now is the time to do it. But just to give you an example, when Trump was in charge, he wanted to give the Philippines clarification on its mutual defense treaty with the United States and said, hey, we'll back you, even in these disputes with China over like the Scarborough and Second Thomas Shoals. Now, thankfully, Duterte said no thanks. But the new ruler of the Philippines is Ferdinand Marcos Jr. And I just wrote an article about this at the Institute. He and Biden have agreed that actually any violation of Philippine sovereignty, even over these little spits of sand that no American could point to on a map, and which aren't important at all. Joe Biden just last week or the week before threatened a war with China over these spits of sand. So it's incredible. Americans are really laser focused on Taiwan. Those Americans who know anything about it and who are paying attention, but there's active little incidents all the time over there. It's very jam-packed. It's very dangerous. And it's really up to the American people to rein in their government, because these policies just perpetuate themselves, as you've documented on this show before. So it's really up to the American public to get educated. That's why I wrote this book. That's why I kept it so short. I understand people are busy and they don't want to read. This book is very, very short. It's like 84 pages, start to finish. You pick up this book, you read it, you give it to your dad, your uncle, your mom, whoever's crazy or scared about China. Look, I'm not going to kid you. China, is nothing to mess with, and it's certainly important enough to our own well-being and our own economic health and the economic health of the world that we should not crave confrontation with China, especially not over something like, for example, certainly not the Scarborough Shoals or something like that, but even Taiwan. Like the whole agreement, this was all laid to bed 40 years ago, and now Washington has decided that it wants to go back on the deal. The strategic reasons for opening to Beijing in the first place no longer exist, and almost immediately the United States, kind of regretted that once the Soviet Union was gone and there was no Soviet Union to balance against. China's utility changed, and the only reason the policies remained geared toward engagement, which there was always a subtle undercurrent of more hawkish people, like you talked about, those generals who wrote those couple of books back in the 90s. There was always a current who said, nah, we should fight the Chinese. The overwhelming view, though, was, look, we'll make them rich by helping them develop their own markets, integrating into the world, getting more trade, getting more industrialization. This will create a middle class who will demand political rights, who will transform China from within. And democracies don't fight one another, and that will make another pliant security partner for us, just like what we have in Europe. This didn't happen, though. And now that, the bill is coming due in China, as you said, they do have great rocket technology and stuff. And there's no doubt that they could absolutely obliterate any U.S. ships that came even 1,000 miles close to Taiwan in a potential conflict. So this is all very dangerous. And it is a fake China threat. China does not threaten the United States. This is not some kind of Sino-centric Red Dawn type scenario. It is completely contrived, and it's meant to sell more ships, more missiles, more planes, period.
Yeah.
John Dickinson was born. At the time of the founding, at the time of the American Revolution, he was absolutely famous. He earned the nickname the Penman of the American Revolution. Excuse me, but few people actually know him today. He's almost totally forgotten. And I'd call him probably maybe the most important founder that most people have never heard of. And in fact, when a lot of people hear about them, not always, but when they hear about him from mainstream historians, you basically get an interest, like they go deeper into this, but the overview that most people look at right at the top, the first paragraph goes kind of like this. And this is right from Thomas Jefferson's, captured Monticello website. And they write about John Dickinson. Best because Dickinson and Jefferson worked pretty closely together on a number of things. And we'll see at the end of the episode here today what Thomas Jefferson had to say about him later in life. But best known today for his refusal to vote for independence, John Dickinson was among the most influential leaders in the Continental Congress. Born into a wealthy slave-owning family, Dickinson was raised in Maryland and Delaware and studied law at the Inns of Court in London. So basically, the takeaway that I think most people would get from that introduction, rather than probably bigger picture things or a different perspective on how this story can be told, which I think you'll hear from me here today, is basically you got a rich slave-owning British lawyer that was opposed to independence. He wasn't even on board with it. And I'm going to do my best to share a different approach, covering some of his top works during the Revolution, maybe in another year. And I've been doing a number of episodes throughout the years on this show, covering Dickinson on or around his birthday. And I think next year or the year after, I'll probably do one covering his work, because we could call him also maybe the father of the Articles of Confederation. He was one of the lead drafters of the Articles of Confederation, and he was a supporter of the Constitution as well some years later. So his takes on that might be interesting as well. But let's start out with some of the things that he did. And of course, he was one of the biggest leaders amongst the Patriots against the Stamp Act. And of course, the Stamp Act was awful, 1765, and he really promoted a peaceful, non-compliance approach to dealing with bad acts by a far-off government, by any government, really. This is how you deal with it. Because if you submit to them and you comply and then you hope you can convince them to stop doing this stuff later on, it's really not going to work too well, because as Dickinson called it, you establish the precedent. Once they can enforce one thing, they will always try to use that as a baseline to expand. And he even warns, and I'll discuss this a little bit later in the show, against the smallest infraction on a constitution, because that is the most dangerous one. That's the one that's easiest for them to establish and build upon. So here's how he put it in his broadside against the Stamp Act. I'm sure this was primarily distributed around Philadelphia in Pennsylvania, but it could have gone broader than that. If you comply with the act, he said, by using stamped papers, you rivet perpetual chains upon your unhappy country. You unnecessarily, voluntarily establish the detestable precedent, which those who have forged your fetters ardently wished for, to varnish the future exercise of this new claimed authority. So every small step to John Dickinson, the penman of the Revolution, every small step against your charter, against your constitution, against your liberty, is a baseline for them to expand more. And you cannot comply with that stuff because, well, you're going to run into a lot of problems. Some persons may think this act of no consequence because the duties are so small. A fatal error. That is the very circumstance most alarming to me. To John Dickinson, the penman of the Revolution, the smallest attack on liberty, the smallest violation of the Constitution is the most dangerous one. And here's how he put it. For I am convinced that the authors of this law would never have obtained an act to raise so trifling a sum as it must do, had they not intended by it to establish a precedent for future use. To console ourselves with the smallness of the duties is to walk deliberately into the snare that is set for us, praising the neatness of the workmanship. And so I think that's letter 6. So for Dickinson, it's all about precedent. And he saw really, really small moves to set a new precedent as probably far more intentional and far more long-term thinking on by the people in power. And I think if we start approaching things like that today, we often heard from people in the last few years in response to the bump stock ban, so-called Second Amendment supporters, all day long. We spent a lot of time opposing this because it doesn't matter if you are an enthusiast or if you're an expert and you think it's a so-called kiddie toy, because that's the kind of thing we would hear. Oh, that's just a kiddie toy. Who cares? They're not even thinking about it. It doesn't affect me. I would never own such a thing, is what we heard so many times. So who cares? We're not going to oppose that. We got the Second Amendment president, so everything's cool because he's not going after the stuff that I want or I own. But that's the problem. Once you establish that detestable precedent by going after something that people won't resist on as much, they're going to build on it. And we see that happening. I'll put it, Dickinson and Jefferson. Our attachment to no nation upon earth should supplant our attachment to liberty. So good. And they wrapped it up with this. This is in the second last paragraph, talking again why they were fighting back. This was a defensive fight in our own native land, in defense of the freedom that is our birthright. Again, The rights and the freedoms that you have are from the nature of your birth. They come from your creator. They come from natural law, natural rights. They come from God. However you want to describe it, they don't come from government. They don't come from charters. Those are declarations of pre-existing rights. In our own native land, in defense of the freedom that is our birthright and which we ever enjoyed till the late violation of it, for the protection of our property acquired solely by the honest industry of our forefathers and ourselves against violence actually offered, we have taken up arms. We shall lay them down when hostilities shall cease on the part of the aggressors, and all danger of their being renewed shall be removed, and not before. That's pretty hardcore for a guy who some historians want us to believe just opposed independence.
San Francisco.
It's so typical of government, just routinely. They're always fibbing and lying and propagandizing. But, Nancy Pelosi had something to say about this, about a wall. I think it's just when Trump was building a wall, she says a wall is an immorality, and she was opposed to it. And then she whispered, except when we have to protect ourselves in our gated communities.
Exactly.
So she was complaining back then, and he for opposing this, but she would never think. Now, I don't like walls. I tell you, I don't think that's a solution. But if you're going to compare walls to walls, the far left would think just even if you would brand expand the definition of a wall, just the protection of borders, just anybody marching in and making it an invasion. No, you can't do that. But you can build walls to protect the elite, and that's okay. And you can protect the walls to protect communist leaders. But I guess no big deal. Probably no big demonstrations. That's fine. There's going to, I'm sure there's going to be a lot of demonstrations today over the people who are in disagreement with the president on his Middle Eastern policy. With Palestinians and Israel.
Yeah.
That's a big deal.
A big deal. In Chicago, people were desperate to leave Venezuela. They were desperate to leave an authoritarian country with a socialist economic system. Put on that next clip. Well, it didn't turn out so well. Migrant family journeys back to Venezuela. More are leaving Chicago as winter looms. The American dream doesn't exist anymore is the quote. They're going back. It's worse than Chicago. It's not worse than Chicago. Chicago is worse than Venezuela.
This is somewhat related, but Brownstone, which is an interesting magazine outlet, had a story recently. Has the U.S. lost its first world status?
Oh.
It's a very good article, and but it talks about exactly what we're looking at, and the answer is I think it is true that financially, I think there's a new rating again today. The rating
negative.
That they can't control as well. That's a much bigger financial statistic. And when you lower that the statistics for our bonds, and it seems like they're able to just sort of forget about that, $33 trillion worth of debt, $1 trillion a year just on interest, and then on, and they play these games, and they're looking for the next war to start or something like that, distract the people. But this whole thing, you have people leaving Chicago, and I think it's sort of a little silly, but they said it's too cold.
Yeah.
I said, well, where's the global warming?
That's right.
Why don't they have a little global warming there? But they're leaving and they don't like it. But I don't think there's a net number leaving yet. But I think a net number is sick and tired of what's going on.
Yeah.
Because as some come, some leave, and I guess we're paying their way out too. But I think those are numbers. But it is significant because their dream of coming to America didn't quite work out the way they thought.
Yeah.
That is definitely the case. And they're leaving. At the same time, they're passing some Venezuelans that are still coming in.
True,
so
true.
It is really a mixed bag. And I think when you look at allies throughout the world, there's such a mixture, and they change all the time. And how can certain countries gang up? It's never talk about voluntarism, bring countries together who would have gentlemen's agreement that we will trade with you if you trade with us.
Yeah.
And we will associate with you. But no, that never seems to happen. There's always somebody wants a special deal until all the deals run out, until the country goes bankrupt. And I think this again is a bankruptcy financially and morally on what we're witnessing in San Francisco as an example. But San Francisco, we pick on them, but we could pick on, just like the Brownstone article, they picked on the whole system, of looking badly,
Well, they left a failed socialist system in Venezuela, and they came to a failed socialist system in the U.S.
Yeah.
Maybe there's something there in it. But let's look at a couple quotes from the article, because it's worth looking at. And let's put on that next clip. The American dream, go back once, please. Yeah, one more. There we go. The American dream doesn't exist anymore, said Castellanos. He laid on a blanket on the bare floor of the station in the afternoon before they left. There's nothing here for us. Migrants said they're realizing the city is at a breaking point. Not only is there no more space in shelters, they also acknowledge that some residents in Chicago oppose the opening of more shelters for them. Castillon said despite the dangerous trek to get there, often begging for money and sleeping on the streets to cross borders, the journey had not been worth it. You shouldn't have gone to Chicago. Go to the next one. He said the family decided to seek asylum in the U.S. because of the extreme poverty in which they were living in Venezuela under Venezuela's authoritarian regime, but the trip wasn't worth it. We just want to be home, he said. If we're going to be sleeping on the streets here, we'd rather be sleeping on the streets over there. So there you have it.
You know,
on Twitter X, 52 attacks on U.S. military forces since October 17th. And if you notice, many of those attacks are in Iraq. And that's what's very interesting about this, because it's not just Syria, it's Iraq. And they're attacking the U.S. It was a few days ago that Secretary Blinken said, I've got one word for all of you out there who are thinking of attacking our bases. Don't. And then they kept doing it, and they kept doing it. So this is something that's simmering below the surface that threatens to explode.
And it potentially big spreading of all this, and this involves Iran, because Iran's bases, people are attacking our bases. That's a major part of it. And I want to take a quote from that article you were talking about. The Biden administration had at first touted that these would deter further aggression on U.S. troops, but they have clearly not done it.
Yeah.
Hasn't done it. But that's what they say. But what do they say about people who oppose things like that? You know, if you happen to be in the Congress and you say that, they want to probably discipline you. You know, because you're un-American.
Yeah.
You know, you're saying this isn't going to do. This is the way we're going to prevent the problems. And they'll get frightened. They'll stop and they won't attack our bases anymore. And isn't it amazing that they talk about our bases? We've been attacked by our bases by the people whose countries we're in.
Yeah, exactly.
The Iraqi people, I know there are a lot of factions. The people that live in Iraq and Syria and all these places, they attack us. And they've attacked us, you know. So we have to punish them, and we have to be tougher. It has nothing to do with this idea that it's just retaliation against what we're doing. How many miles? 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 miles away we have bases, and it just goes on, and they never stop and think. And people say, you know, you hear it routinely, whether it's conservative or liberal, the stations say, you know, we just can't let them get away with attacking us like this. Well, why don't we just get out of their way? We're in their country, you know. But so far, I gave them my 2 cents worth, and it probably wasn't worth 2 cents because not much has come of it.